For today, again, backed by continuous popular demand, one of our most popular session speakers and session leads is Graham Furnis. Most of you have heard Graham's bio before, but we'll do a really quick bio again. Graham Furnis is fully immersed and passionate in providing ITSM solutions. He is a business-driven IT professional with 20-plus years of technology and management experience. Graham's certified as an ITIL manager and expert, as well as an accredited ITIL instructor. So with that, I will bring back Graham Furnis. Graham.
Great. Well, thank you, Rick, and welcome everyone to our Thought Rock lunchtime session. I always find with the topic that I have today, it's always brings out a lot of interest and good discussion in trying to define IT services. And certainly today, hopefully it'll allow us to think about a few other issues that come up and challenges where it can make you think a little bit differently than some of the standard information out there. So we'll have a bit of fun. So the title of the presentation, Top of the Pyramid Defining IT Services. We'll get a little bit further into that as we start. But we'll kind of get a good understanding about structure within the definition of services and how services actually are put together. And through that discussion, we can kind of understand a couple of different approaches. So just so we can maximize our time, I'm going to go to our agenda slide here. And it's basically broken up into three parts. I would like to start off with just, because we are within an ITSM environment and an ITIL environment, just some standard definitions to make sure we're all on the same page. And then get into also a bit of a diagram and discussion of what a structure of a service can be or should be. And then we go down and we look at defining IT services. And we have a top-down and bottom-up sort of view and approach. Then we extend it a bit further and go into understand so where are we going to define in these services and how as well can we manage them. So as questions come up, feel free to type it in the chat box. I don't mind any time. It'll add to the discussion. And we're going to get started with slide number 1. It's a bit of a full slide with text on here. And don't worry, it's not a presentation of definitions. This is, I think, the only one that I put in here. So just a couple of quick definitions. And these are taken from the ITIL books. ITIL's actually in its new refresh edition. It's updated the definition of a service, thankfully, to a bit more language which I'm used to speaking with clients and in which people understand. So our first definition at the top. At the top here we have, let me get my pen tool here. So IT service. So any combination of technology, people, and processes. And this is where this is usually what I do when I talk with my clients. You're basically bundling up together all of the hardware and software that your end users and customers know about, and then you're providing some type of benefit to them in the business they're doing. So it may also include a combination of people, perhaps the support desk, other processes like the support processes with an incident and problem and change and so on. So what this IT service is trying to do, this bundle of hardware and software, we're trying to deliver value to our customers. We're trying to help them achieve outcomes. And of course, we'll keep it simple today. We're just talking about services within our organization. So we're helping our customers, our other organizational staff, help to achieve their business outcomes. And then here's the standard definitions that's in ITIL for a while. Without the ownership of cost and risk, meaning that you, the service provider, you deliver me the service, and don't let me worry about how I have to tweak it, maintain it, and support it. You can do that. So that's really it. The only thing I want to focus at the very bottom here, when we talk about outcomes, so we're trying to achieve some type of result. A standard and always a practical way of talking about IT services, think from the business perspective, they need to be business focused. And certainly when I get into some of the steps for defining a service, you'll see that business focus, we can tie a certain way into it to make sure we are always delivering value to the business, not to the customer. It's actually value to the business. Okay, so I think that's enough for just raw definitions. So let's take a look at the next piece then. So we have our bundles of software and hardware. That's what our service is. And then here's the standard structure, which I've used in the past, and it's now in the refresh ITIL books. They talk about this as well. Here's the basic structure of our IT service. So at the very top, we have our core IT service. And that's, if you think about a service catalog, this is the primary listing that you're going to see in your catalog saying, here's what something offers, and you can go and purchase that, and it'll work for you. And then typically what we do in order to better manage services, we try and break it down to say, well, okay, within that core service, do we have anything that we can separate out and say, this is a bit different. We can actually view this as a separate entry, and it's one of our enabling services. So what it will do is that without the enabling service, you'll never be able to achieve the core IT service. But what it allows us to do is to break it down. We can understand more of the key elements that make up the service, and therefore we can come up with different contingency plans and change plans and so on in order to make sure our service is delivered the best it can. And then ITIL also has this little piece over here called enhancing services. And enhancing services are basically things which, think of it as marketing. They're little additional services which help to drive and achieve customer satisfaction and keep our customers coming back for more. So quite often what happens over time with those enhancing services, they end up becoming things which are expected, so they actually become part of the enabling service. But just for simplicity's sake, let's just take a look at this diagram and think about underneath the core service, break it down to see if you can define separate and unique enabling IT services, because you can manage them differently and therefore achieve different combinations. And where possible, think about the enhancing services, because that'll really help to drive what we've always talked about in ITIL and ITSM, which is customer satisfaction. Okay, so I'm sure you're looking at this and you're saying, that's nice. maybe it'd be good if we have an example. And we actually, just to preface it, we will get to an example. There's a few more slides down the road. But we'll take this structure and we'll take a couple of other steps about defining an IT service. And then we'll run through a way of how this structure and the steps can work together. But we need another piece before we get there. So we need to go to our next slide. And we need to talk about pyramids. So in my little pyramid slide, and it's the title of our presentation, and Rick, I'll bring you in just for a bit of fun. So where should services sit in our structure and our picture of a pyramid?
I would suggest the services are at the top of the pyramid, I would think.
So this kind of top? That look good?
That's a good top.
Okay. So let's take that for a minute. So services, it certainly is, you're correct, and I'm going to add another piece to it. Services definitely are at the top of the pyramid. As you start to go further below the pyramid, then you get your the other elements of your actual hardware and software, and then way down in the networks and server rooms, you get all of your underlying infrastructure components. So services are definitely at the top of the pyramid, but they're not the top of the pyramid. So I'm doing a little bit of a word play on my presentation title. Business processes are actually the top of the pyramid. So while services are at the top, business processes are the top that you're trying to achieve. And this ties back into, there's a whole bunch of different models out there for defining services. No matter what the model is, somewhere in the model they always talk about try and tie a service back to a business process. Because earlier when we talked about the definition of a service, we were talking about business outcomes. And the primary way that we achieve a business outcome is look at the business process or a business function, whatever it might be, that's actually doing the work of the organization. So really the top of the pyramid are business processes. Services are the next step down, the IT top of the pyramid. And then, so these are our first two steps, and if I bring up the rest of the diagram here, so then the rest of the structure and the rest of the steps is that once you start with the business process and you're understanding what the business does and what it's trying to achieve, then you can go through and define your IT services from a business perspective, link that in turn to your IT systems, which end users and customers see and feel and they know about, and then link it down even further to the components. So this really gives you the structure of what a service is. And if I go a bit further here, there's basically two approaches to defining services. Clearly, with the one I've just mentioned here, we're dealing with a top-down approach. Right? We're starting with the business processes. We're then defining services, looking at the systems that are then attached, and we can group them together into that structure we had in the previous slide. And then we can go down one step further and look at the components. So we'll talk about the bottom-up approach after we get through a couple of the first few slides here. But this is the standard way that pretty much every publication I've seen and people talk about. They always talk about defining services from a top-down approach. And I've got a bit of an argument about how also a bottom-up approach is useful as well.
Graham, a quick question for you.
Yep.
So again, from your experience, do you still see, though, that organizations are still getting stuck at this point from an idle perspective in terms of just agreeing on defining a service or what a service is?
Yep. And it's not surprising, it just is. Organizations are still stuck, especially when they get these top-down models, because they're looking at this and going, well, what's the business process? No one's telling me. Or it's very complicated and we can't figure it out or separate it. So quite often there's a bit of a challenge in getting the business process itself and just other things, just to go off tangent a little bit. The whole work of building up an ITSM capability of initiating a process, philosophy and framework and capability in your company, it's not small work. It's quite complicated. It's organizational change, and you have to manage that. And of course, the whole purpose of all these different processes in the ITIL framework and other frameworks is to manage services. So there's a lot of fear, I find, too. People really get stuck because they fear that if I get the service definition wrong, then everything else will fall apart. So I'll talk a bit more about that later on. But yeah, people are definitely stuck in this area, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for it. And part is fear, part is complexity, and part is just not having all the information when you need it, which is why I talk about also a bottom-up approach is needed for practical purpose, which we'll get to in a little bit in this slide. So let's stay with the top-down approach and see if this helps to clear things up for some people who may have had trouble here before. So, I'm going in the wrong direction. Here's my slide. So when I do a top-down approach, I find that, I don't know if everyone's familiar with the ITIL term of a vital business function, but I tend to like a top-down approach myself for the organization's key business processes and functions. And the definition is at the bottom. It's any part of the organizational business process that's critical to the success of the business. And if you want to ask the business about what they do, they very much know all about vital business functions and vital processes to the organization. And they can very much say, here's where we need support from an IT perspective in getting us working through and achieving success with this function. So I'm not the only one, but it's one of the things I tend to promote is that when you want to start with business processes, when you get a lot of business cooperation and knowledge about they know what they're doing at their own end, then you can take the business process and roll it down to say, okay, well, what are some IT services that have meaning to you? And of course, we're going to define the service from a business perspective, customer language. We're going to use their own business terminology. And then once we come up with these sort of groupings of here's where we need to have a supporting IT service, then we can say, great, well, here's all of the hardware and software we currently own, manage, or we know about that we could acquire. And that's when you start putting together your systems into those service definitions and down into the actual implementation piece. So I'm actually going into kind of configuration concepts, but that's where you define your components as you drill right down to the remainder of the IT infrastructure. So the bulk of the work, though, if you're a business analyst or a project manager or anyone in charge of trying to define services, you have good information about your vital business functions and your processes. It'll make it a lot easier just to come up with a definition of services. And don't be surprised that after you go through the first round of coming up with a definition of a service, when you start putting it together and you use it for a little bit, you're going to learn it's the continual improvement concept, which I've been talking about a lot and is talked about a lot within ITIL. You can do as much research and planning at the beginning. You still might get things a bit not wrong, but not totally correct, because as you move forward and you have this new definition of a service, you may realize that, hey, maybe it needs to be broken down or redefined a little bit for us to manage things a bit better. So that's the other thing I find, too, holding people up around services. They think it's defined once and never touched. But throughout ITIL and my own personal philosophy, this is always evolving. Not every second, but it does need to evolve because you learn and improve as you go. Okay, so let's go into, I've got two slides here to just kind of run down an example of picking the service structure that we saw a few slides ago and taking this top-down approach. And I've done it with a simple example of today's presentation. So we have a business process, and today we have a virtual presentation. Pretty important because we're dealing with you, our Thought Rock members, and customers. So we can define what we need to get done. And just to keep it simple, we're just going to say there's an offsetting or equivalent core virtual presentation service. Now, if we just stop there, that's fine. We can manage things, and in the ITIL world, we can structure all of our processes around it. But let's take this a bit further. And we say, well, let's try and figure out, can we break this apart into our enabling services? So if I go back to the business process and I say, what are the two separate, enabling activities or business functions within virtual presentations? And one, I have some type of visual display, and two, I have a verbal means of communicating. Okay, so you might look at that and say, nice to know. Why are we going here? Well, what I might do is take those two things and I might make them enabling IT services. And then what I can do now is say, okay, really, virtual presentation services, instead of it being provided by, see, if I think of a service as just one thing, I might think maybe we just want to use one type of medium in order to deliver it. But when I break it apart to separate, distinct enabling services, now I can say, well, I should have a separate virtual display service. And today we're using GoToMeeting. And I can have a separate communication service. And today I'm using a phone line, hardwired phone, just for a bit more clarity and sort of continuity planning. So when we're defining a service and we adopt this ITIL idea that you want to talk about enabling IT services, it really helps out a lot. We can really manage it a lot better by doing that. And if I take it one step further, so what are some enhancing services we could do? Well, it would be great if we have some type of virtual boardroom service. And whoops, and then I'll take it over here into the systems approach. So going back here, you'll see that what I'm going to end up doing is taking the, down here, taking the enhancing service, and I'm going to link it to the Thought Rock platform. So here we have our service breakdown. If anyone's not following, just type in a quick message. But you'll see that we have virtual presentation services. It's enabled by virtual display and communication services, and we're going to enhance it with boardroom services. And now I can take my understanding of the service and say what systems can attach to it. Right? Step number 3 is attach your services to systems. So if I start over here, so my core IT service is virtual presentation services. And in this particular case, it's going to be made up of 2 of my enabling IT services. So I have GoToMeeting. That'll handle the virtual display. And I have go-to conference and a phone line, those are the two key pieces I need to have good communication to enable the combination of a virtual presentation. And if I bring up the last piece, for my enhancing service, well, we're going to use the ThoughtRock Live platform. So now it's very much, business users understand this. Anyone doing a presentation through the ThoughtRock medium would understand this. Here's what virtual presentation services means from our business perspective. Here's the enabling services and how they tie to enabling business functions. And there's a little excitement factor with ThoughtRock Live. So it's crystal clear. So hopefully it's not a very elaborate example. I don't want to go into anything too complex when you're dealing with slides. And certainly in the real world, this gets a lot more complex. But hopefully it gives you an idea. We've just gone through steps 1, 2, and 3. We had the business process, very important, so it's easy enough for us to define. We went through and broke it down to define our IT services and came up with the structure of core, enabling, and enhancing services. We did step 3. We linked it to our IT systems. And then I could take this further, but now it's IT related. And from a business perspective, we don't want to see all the underlying pieces that make my IT systems work. The customers only care about this level. This is what they're using. This is what they see. Step 4 is meant to be an internal IT activity. Okay, so that's our example of a top-down approach, and hopefully that little example too just gives you a bit of something to follow in terms of your efforts to define an IT service. So that's great if everything in the world is a vital business function. Oh, I forgot one thing. I mentioned before about continual improvement. I forgot about this part of my slide. What you typically find is as you start defining a service and you break it down to enabling services and so on, because we're using ThoughtRock Live, and in this case is our key enhancing service, really from a business perspective, this becomes something unique. Instead of just any type of virtual presentation, this becomes a ThoughtRock virtual presentation service. And now I can go somewhere else and say, well, you know what, maybe we need a separate virtual presentation services internal, which would be a different structure. We typically wouldn't have the enhancing service of ThoughtRock Live for those internal board meetings. So again, as you start to define and structure a service and you take a look at it, continual improvement, you're going to learn from it, and you go back to redefining a service. Okay, into the next approach. So into our next approach, we have the bottom up. And you'll notice here I've moved the pyramid down a little bit. In the bottom up approach, we have to start a little bit higher up, and we're basically going to invert the pyramid and come up with a second pyramid. What you have to do in this case is typically where in most cases for your non-vital business functions, the business isn't really well defining its business processes. You're not really quite sure of how it connects to what the business is actually trying to accomplish. So the reason the pyramid inverted here is that we have to kind of do a bit of a research. Our business analysts have to go and find out who's using what we have. So in this respect, business processes are up at the top here, and we're missing something in between. And common ITIL terminology here, the customer is in between the service and the business process, right? They're the ones who need something from IT in order to do something. So in this case, I've added customers into to my approach here. And what I typically do, I start off at the bottom with step number 1, and I come up with a listing of my common systems that everyone's using. And then I don't try and wrap them into services yet, because why would I? I have no idea. If I do all the work, I don't know if it means anything to the business. So instead I jump over here and I research who my customers are, who's using my systems. Once I know my customers, then I can jump up here and say, what are you using it for? And that'll come up with my defined business processes. And I also learn the customer language because, again, when I define my services, it's got to be using business terminology. It's got to be customer-facing. So once we do a little investigation, a little bit of research, we now know who's using what. We know what they're using it for. Now I can come down to step number 4. The final step here is actually defining services. And then I can go through and mix and match my systems. And as I do this, I'll probably learn a few things and have to go back through the cycle a bit in order to refine my service catalog. Okay, so to finish off this one then, let's try the same example or a similar example to what we had before. Okay, we're going to have a top-down example, and we're going to start off over here on the right-hand side where we have Microsoft Word, right? And someone told us we have to put this and define it as a service in our service catalog. So the traditional approach which I've seen a lot of my clients saying, great, well, let's put it in the service catalog as word processing or MS Word. And I said, well, that's great, but that's your wording. You want to go through the cycle and understand it from your customers. So the line sort of shows it here. Over here on the right, these are my customers. And I go and find out who in our organization is using MS Word. Then I go to my next step and I say, great, what are their business processes? What are they using it for? Some groups are publishing. Some groups are using it for reporting, financials. I'm finding there's a whole bunch of different activities. And here I have to make a choice. Am I going to create a separate service for all of these business processes? Through a bunch of discussion, what eventually we'll do when you get down to step 4 is you say, well, it's such an organizational-wide type of use. Let's call this desktop productivity services. And this goes over well because my business users understand that, and they agree with the title. And so now I certainly know one of the enabling service or systems for my my core IT service is going to be Microsoft Word. All right, so we have a connection already. And then as I'm starting to analyze that, now I put together this productivity services element up here, and I see that Microsoft Word is one of my key enabling IT services. I might do a little bit more research and say, well, there's also a spreadsheet service in there, and people do documentation storage. And it might lead me to say over here that, well, you know what, probably we should add Excel, Explorer, etc. As other key enabling services under this desktop productivity one. And then I might even say, well, are there any enhancing services for productivity services? And I might say, wouldn't it be great if we had an integrated desktop? And I take it a step further and say, well, Microsoft Office will do that. And in fact, Microsoft Office contains a lot of these pieces over here. So suddenly, desktop productivity services, I only started with Word, but when I start to go out and understand the business and start putting pieces together, you start to realize all the different relationships, and you start grouping them because it makes sense from a business and a service definition point of view. So there's the two basic approaches. That's the bulk of the presentation. I have about 5 minutes just to finish off. But really, to be successful in defining IT services, there is no right or wrong definition of a service. If I went to anyone's organization and they said, does it look like we've defined our services right? I can't really answer that because it's in the eyes of your business. If the business and your customers and users understand the definition of a service, well, then you're on the right track. If they don't, then that's your self-test that you need to do a little bit of tweaking and adjustment. And then you want to, when you're defining your services, there's a whole bunch of other little factors which I can't get into everything, but you definitely want to use a top-down and a bottom-up approach. Typically, I find that the top-down approach works on your vital business functions, and the bottom-up approach, actually, I noticed it says top-down on my slide. I just caught that. That should be read up here, bottom-up. So I'm going to cross that out. So in a bottom-up approach, you start with your systems, and then you work your way back up. Okay. So the last two things. to finish off and try to keep to our timelines. So where do we define services? And this goes back to the ITIL framework. Maybe I can bring Rick in for this. Rick, any idea of where you think we might define our services in the framework?
How about right smack in the middle?
Right smack in the middle in strategy is the most correct answer. And if I bring up all the pieces here, actually ITIL talks about defining services potentially because not everyone has every element of the life cycle formally defined in their organization. Traditionally, in version 2 of ITIL, we always use service level management to go ahead and define services. And so if you're doing it that way, there's nothing wrong. It's nice because we have a process area and people who are accountable for doing it and getting it done. Service catalog management, I put this up here. Not that I would say they should be the ones defining services, but there would be nothing wrong if they did. Again, it's however you structure your program of ITSM, where you might decide that we're going to have a catalog initiative, we're going to set people accountable for defining services, and then they can disseminate that service name and structure to the rest of the organization. Over in the strategy side, service definitions are very much strategic because everything you do from a management perspective and from a delivering business value perspective is strategy. So service portfolio management could be the strategic side of where you take accountability for defining those services. And I've even put in here financial management. They have a very much a vested interest in services because they would like to account for, from a charging or at least a cost control point of view, what we do in IT. And the more they can roll it up and link it to business functions, the better off they are. So where we define services, here's just 4 different areas. I put them up as the key 4 areas within ITIL of where you might decide to give some accountability to do this, or you might just do it as a project, not formally as a process area. The next slide has all the pieces here. Is about how do we manage services. And so keeping up the same 4 areas where we talk about service level management, service catalog management, portfolio, and financial management, here's some of the key pieces which we use to manage these services. So agreements, anyone who's been in the ITIL and ITSM world, I'm sure you're familiar with service level agreements, and we can break that down within IT to operational level agreements and underpinning contracts for my vendors. So that's how we're going to manage these services. Once we define them, we can start saying what we're going to do for them and how they're going to help the business and formal targets through those agreements. It'd be great as well if we have a business case for those services saying, well, here's why it exists. And this helps me to link back up to the higher business processes and understanding about my own internal capabilities about why I should and shouldn't do some of the things I do. Financial management, they're going to manage things with our costs and our budgets. You know, finance loves numbers. They're going to produce a lot of numbers based upon services. And then I've left the best for the end here. 2 critical things. Rick, which do you think is the most critical between a service owner and a service catalog for managing services?
The most critical, wow, loaded.
It's a tough question.
It is a tough question. I don't know. I'm gonna take a guess and say it's without the catalog, it would be very difficult to manage the services. So I'm gonna say the catalog is pretty important.
Bingo. You're correct. At least I agree with you. Right? This is our opinion. It's not written up anywhere. But I would think as well, from my experience and from, again, seeing companies challenged, you've got to write this down somewhere. It's no good just coming up with the definition of a service and then doing a whole bunch of agreements on that one definition. You have hundreds of services out there. And as you start to define those services, that's the purpose of the service catalog, or at least one of them. You need a central place to know all the different services that we've defined, and when I start to come up with agreements, well, they're going to link to one or more, whatever it might be, in my service catalog. My business case is for services in my catalog. All of my cost accounting is for a service in my catalog. So, it's where I go to when I want to know exactly what we're doing in IT, and then I can look at the related links about how it's managed. And then the reason service owners is up here in the middle is that if you just put things in a catalog and hope that a process by itself might once in a while pick it up and review it and so on, things tend not to happen. So because services are important to the business, they're important to IT, they're in a catalog, but you know what happens when you file things in a file cabinet? They tend to stay there and they tend to fall to the bottom. So having a person, a service owner, own those services, one or two or a bunch of those services within the catalog, they're there to manage them, keep them alive, keep pulling the files out and reviewing them every once in a while, and then they can go back to make sure agreements, business cases, and our cost controls are all working as they should do. So it's one of the basic generic roles defined within ITIL. They talk about service owners and process owners. And again, when we talk about defining IT services, when we get down to this slide about talking about how you manage them, you need them in a catalog, you need your list of services, and you need your service owners who are accountable to make sure that once they're published, they don't just sit there and never get looked at or improved over time. Okay, so that's pretty much it. The last slide I have here is just how else do we manage services, and you manage it throughout the entire life cycle. So that's why we have the ITIL service life cycle here. You manage strategy with all the strategy processes, whichever you choose to implement, your design and performance measurements, transitioning, operation, and improvement. All the rest of the framework is here to manage around the concept of a service. Okay, so we went a little bit past our 12:30 time, but enough that hopefully it's given you a good little bit of information to think about when defining IT services. Thinking about the structure and the different approaches from a top-down or bottom-up certainly makes a bit of a difference. And just to summarize, and I'll just go through a couple of last slides before questions. So when defining IT services, again, a top-down approach I find good for vital business functions. I find a bottom-up approach for most other things because not everything in an organization is a vital business function. And then whenever I'm talking about any type of method or approach, I'm always focused on the business process, right? I need to make sure I'm delivering business value. In terms of managing IT services, we just saw on the last slide, having service owners and service catalogs is important. Because service owners and catalogs will work together to make sure the agreements and business cases and all of the cost control measures are being looked at and have some type of focal point, which is the service. And then the rest of the ITIL lifecycle, whatever processes or functions you may have in place, they can be used as well to manage that service and make sure it's delivered with highest possible value and quality. Okay, so that's our presentation. You can do a bit of continued reading. I'll just do a quick slide here. A couple of related blogs, and I'll just point them out. They're free for you to read if you're interested. A part of the presentation, I haven't got the second part in there yet, but there's a blog for just the overview of the initial top-down approach. There's a couple of other blogs down at the bottom here which talk about developing a service catalog and making it actionable. Of course, is an important piece. It's actually the next step when you're defining services is then, well, how do I manage and develop the service catalog? Because that's a critical element of keeping track of what I've done. And another quick little plug as well, just the next presentation. I don't have my calendar up in front of me, but I know it's in, I think, October, because I'm off doing a lot of work in September. But one of the workshops we have, and it relates to so many different things. doing continual service improvement and going through and prioritizing my improvements, my activities, through a pain point analysis. This can actually be used in so many different things. Problem solving, it can be used in change management assessment and so on. It can be used in evaluating IT services, defining which ones are the most important. So we're going to take a bit of that workshop and just kind of summarize it during the lunch break, just to kind of give you an idea about another quick technique to improving your service management capabilities and getting a sense about how we can take simple tools like a spreadsheet, start documenting simple types of initiatives and activities. And you've heard this a few times from myself and other speakers here on ThoughtRock, and then link these initiatives to our key performance indicators so that we can really start to say which are the most important things we need to do first. So I always find that's the biggest challenge in a lot of the IT work we do. There's a lot we can be doing, but we really should be focused on those things which deliver the most value, and we can do it based upon a KPI analysis, which is part of this workshop, and trying to find quick wins out of our pain points. So just a little primer, and then so that'll be it, Rick.
That's excellent, Graham. So we have a number of questions here, so I want to make sure that we get to them prior to anybody logging off. So I know we have Bev, and we have Paran, and we have Matt, who have some great questions. So if folks want to stick around for these. And again, just quickly in case folks have to drop off, again, ThoughtRock Live will be postponed for next Tuesday. The next ThoughtRock Live session again is on September the 13th, Tuesday, September the 13th, and it will be with John Towsley presenting Asset Velocity, Accelerate the Learning Curve for your support team. So please look for, again, your continued follow-up newsletters and information from the ThoughtRock team, and also you can check on site to get any other updates. But stay tuned for some other great topics, and again, keep those ideas flowing in terms of speaker content and topics for us. And again, for anybody that's going to be at Fusion in September, the ThoughtRock team will be live at Fusion as well. So hopefully we'll see you there. Some great questions right now. The first one comes from Bev, and it's, can you clarify the costs? So I think, Graham, this is back to close to the beginning of your discussion. Can you clarify the cost part as their help desk is outsourced, and any time they add new service, there's an additional cost?
Oh, I'm not sure if Bev is referring to this part or at the very...
It was earlier on. The question came really early on, Graham, so it might have been at the very beginning of when you were talking about defining the services. Just maybe talking about specifically just the definition area.
Yeah.
So is there anything about the definition in terms of, can you clarify that as when you think it costs as part of the help desk that's being outsourced?
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand the nature of the question. I think I'll go along the lines of when you're outsourcing different elements of the service desk and trying to get support for different services, right? That's when we have our service definition. I'm just trying to think in terms of the defining of an IT service. I mean, it's going to be the same type of thing. What typically happens in that case, in fact, what I want to do is jump down a little bit to this slide here. So if I bring up all these pieces here. So from an outsourcing point of view, we're typically starting here and saying, okay, well, there's a whole bunch of different things that we need to outsource because we believe an outsourcer is more cost capable of managing these specific systems. Typically, we don't outsource the traditional service definition because service is delivered to our organization. And even if there's an outsourced third-party vendor, the service definition is in our service catalog, and it's made up of a combination of, again, with the definition, it's not just technology, it's also people and process. And we have a service desk, which is part of my service package, which I'm delivering to my internal organization. So from the outsourced point of view, the definition and the ways to define a service don't change, but typically we're focused down here, in which really what we're trying to do is say, well, we need to have someone else go and manage these different systems, and then I still have to do the same work internally, I have to then say, well, I need to understand a service definition so within IT I can manage it, and it needs to be business focused from my organization's point of view. So I think, which slide would that be where I had the bottom-up approach? Here we go. So really that's
and Graham, sorry, I was just going to say, Graham,
approach.
the other thing may be that we've also indicated that if Bev wants to contact you directly, which is just to make sure that you're going down the same route that she's thinking, that you can arrange for that, and the contact information is there as well. So maybe we can just so we can get the next couple questions in as well.
Yep.
So that would be great. So let's move on to the next question, which is there's three areas that where we have problems defining, and that is email. Three areas we have problems defining are email. Is it a service or a business process as it spans across the organization as the main communication tool? And desktop, is it a core service, enabling, or an enhanced service? And then he's got down here back-end or infrastructure services. What are your thoughts with regards to these items based on your experience?
Well, that's a great question. So let me start off with email. Is it a process or a business process or a service? It's definitely a business process, and it's definitely an IT service. And I've seen so many different ways to talk about email. Maybe the way I can address that particular part of the question is when you think about email, and so from a business perspective, everyone says we just need email. It's a critical organizational-wide business process for communication. If we just talk about email, then we're limited to thinking about, also a limited technology solution. So, you have your BlackBerries, you have your service within the organization, and so on. You could work with the business to say, I understand email. I would think of it more as an enabling service, or maybe even enhancing service. It doesn't matter which I do. I might actually roll it down, though, and say, really, it's a communication service and a communication process throughout the organization. So very much, organizations should have this discussion around it as being one of their vital business functions, because you really have a lot of productivity and cost factor when your communication business process doesn't happen, or when an IT service fails. And I would recommend that, let me try and bring up a slide that I can talk around it a bit. So in the structure of a service, I wouldn't put it, or I wouldn't recommend putting it up at the top as my my core service. Because if I do that, then I'm kind of limited in my thinking. I'd rather think more about the core service being something like communication. And I'm just going from my preference and when I've had different discussions in organizations. And then it becomes one of my enabling services underneath that. And the reason I like that is because another enabling service could be the telephone. And then you have cell phones. You might even have Skype and some other technology that you can drill down when you start breaking things apart. And then it becomes clear to everyone, because sometimes in the business it's not clear what to do when a service is not available. So if we call something communication services and email and cell phone, and you might even put BlackBerries in and just give it a more service-oriented name. But if that's part of my enabling services, then if people get that visual in their mind, they also think about, if one of them fails, what are the other options I can go to? So, so that's my thoughts about email in terms of it being, is it a process or a service? It's both. It's one of my key business services. I'm sorry, key business processes, and one of my key IT services. And again, I would like to not make it a core, either process or service. I'd like to make it an enabling one, because that way I can think more about the generic business activity of communication. We need to be in communication on a regular time. And then the other part of that question was about the overall desktop. Would you see desktop services as being a core, enabling, or even further down as being an infrastructure type of service? And I think I did that in my example of the bottom-up approach. Here it is, I think. Is this the right slide? This is the one. So, and here's an example where I called something desktop productivity service. So that could be very much a core service, because from a business point of view, it just allows us to be more productive. We can quickly create documents, financial calculations and analysis, and a whole bunch of things with this core desktop service. This service could become, even though it's a core service, it is an infrastructure service because everything else sits on top of it. It's our desktop PC, essentially. But everyone needs to know what it's there for, right? I don't want to bury it down as infrastructure and try and take it out of my, my service catalog, because everyone has a desktop with, in my example here, the IT systems that make up desktop productivity services. So I want my business users to be aware of it because it exists, they're touching it. It links to all of these different business processes, which we've now summarized as being productivity processes. It allows me to understand a bit more about how to manage this, and again, from my customer and business perspective, what they should expect. So even though this is going to be linked, this will be an enabling service to all other services. That's fine. When I start classifying and categorizing my services, I won't change the core service definition, but I'll just give it a classification as enterprise-wide, or perhaps as a platform. I mean, the next steps of defining IT services is then, once you start defining them, a whole bunch of classification and categorization to help better understand about how these things fit together. So hopefully that helps a bit. Again, that's my opinion about where I would put desktop productivity type services. That would be a core service for me because it's made up of so many smaller enabling pieces, and it's a key thing I want to talk about with my customers. It's a key thing I want to manage.
Okay, Graham, thanks. We have 2 questions left. Just to keep you, I don't know if you get through them both. We have 5 minutes before we do have a hard stop at 1 o'clock.
Yep.
Matt definitely says, thanks, that adds clarity, so that's great. So again, Matt, if you wanted to contact Graham, you can go directly to Graham, and if you have any other questions, please do. So our next question comes from Paran. Again, we have just under 5 minutes to do this. How does customer interaction / feedback play in the top-down approach of the pyramid?
The quick answer is that it's a cycle. So if I go to my top-down slide again, so where customers fit into this is that when I'm doing the discussion of what are my vital business functions, I need to be talking to someone from the business with that, and those are going to be my customers. My customers are going to be representing their business processes. So really, in step number 1, at the very top of the pyramid and top-down approach, you're going to involve your customers right off the bat, just to say, what are the key things that you can't fail with or are critical for us earning revenue or driving the overall business, and that's where you're going to have your discussion right here. And then they're going to start using their business terminology, and you're going to say, okay, well, we need to have technology as a service to help you in this area of your business function. And we'll take those business words, and they're going to become service definitions. So it's a good question. So in this particular slide, my customers didn't disappear. My customers are right here, because they're the ones who are telling me about their vital business processes and the key business functions which can't fail, which will become my services.
Excellent.
Okay, there was one more,
question. Yeah, last question from Eric. It is, what are your thoughts on considering service expansion as part of building solid business processes?
Service expansion. I'm not sure what's meant by service expansion in terms of either adding new services to the catalog or new technology in general to IT. But from what I understand of the question and my thoughts around the whole concept of evolution. So when we're talking about defining IT services and we're talking about continual improvement, I'd mentioned before that it's not just a simple 1, 2, 3, 4 set of steps. As you start defining services and you start breaking them down into the core, enabling, and enhancing, you start to get a better understanding of them. And then you might go back up and say, well, we have a better understanding of the business processes that are involved. So that's actually a cycle. again, it's not just a linear way that we define IT services. You're going to be going back and learning from it and redefining them or improving them over time. And the natural result of that will be, I won't call it just expansion of services. It'll also be contraction of services. You're going to get rid of some things which just don't have any relevance. And you're going to add more services or divide a service up into two separate names because you might find things that are more relevant. I think we did that with our top-down example because if I go to that slide, as we're going through and we start to look at the core and enabling services, we said, well, you know, we can add a lot of excitement using the ThoughtRock platform. We then said, well, you know what? That makes this slightly different than the original virtual presentation service we were thinking of. This is actually a virtual presentation services for ThoughtRock, and then we have a separate virtual presentation services for you know, internal boardroom meetings where people are scattered. So that's an example where I've just expanded my service catalog. I've taken what would have been just virtual presentations, and now I have two different virtual presentations because they're uniquely different. So hopefully that adds a little bit of insight to that question, and I understood it correctly and explained it well.
Excellent, and from what it sounds like, the feedback that from Eric says bingo, so you got it. So thanks again, Graham, for that, for clarifying that for the group. So great questions, and again, if there's any other questions, please everyone feel free. The information is up there in terms of phone, email, to make sure that it goes through our team that will make sure that Graham gets specifically the additional questions, and he'll have some follow-up there. But again, majority of you stayed around right until 1 o'clock today, so that's fantastic. So also kudos to the content and the speakers. So Graham, thanks a lot again for another great session on ThoughtRock Live. And again, I've already indicated about September 13th. So again, check your weekly newsletters for more information, or at any time get on ThoughtRock Live. It's 1 o'clock. We thank everybody, and have a great holiday weekend to everyone on both sides of the border, and we will see you back in ThoughtRock Live on September 13th. Thanks, Graham.
Well, thank you, Rick, and thank you, everyone.